So, hi class. For today, um, we'll be discussing about elements and typologies in the community. So, how do we know that a community is a community? So, paano natin masasabi na ang komunidad ay isang komunidad? While yes, we have definitions or we at the very least strive to establish definitions that will fit on the concept of community, may mga particular na elemento or features or characteristics that are very much how do you call this, prevalent, observable when we talk about the context or rather concept of a community. So sa 2001 study ni McQueen at ng mga colleagues niya, community daw has 5 core elements. On a more general sense, merong 5 core elements ang isang community. First is the locus. Pag sinabi natin locus is the location, lugar. Followed by sharing. May nagaganap na um, parang may Tagalog na sharing. Pag-share. Sorry, papalitan. Pagpapalitan, pagbibigayan of some sort ng uh, tangible or intangible na mga bagay. But there's the context of sharing, pagbibigayan. Yan, pagbibigayan. Followed by joint action. So, may pagka-pare-parehas o yung mga ginagawa nila or rather, gumagalaw sila as a unit, as a community, as a group. Social ties, may connection sila, social connections. So, either they can be family, neighbors, friends, and again, the idea of social ties is they at the very least they have that certain sense of social connection. May social interaction sila at they are connected um, with one another. Then diversity, may pagkakaiba-iba in a sense that hindi lang physical features but on how they think, mostly on their socioeconomic status. But that doesn't mean that they don't share similarities, share things, share behavior, that they don't act as a group or are not socially connected, regardless if they live in the same or some sense they don't live in the same locale. But while these are the key elements, or according sa study McQueen, truth is may mas malawak pa na version. Ito yung 5 key elements, core elements. Pero pag hinimay-himay pa natin to, siyam yung actual na elements, observable elements or features para masabing ang isang community ay isang community. So, we can think of the concept of community as interest-based, action-based, gaya nung kanina, sharing, joint action. But those will be discussed for the next meeting. For this meeting, we'll focus on location-based communities. Kasi ito yung napakadaling i-characterize the version ng community. So, when it comes to location-based communities, there are 10 elements pala, hindi 9, 10 elements. 10 elements. Yung isa kasi problematic. Mamaya papaliwanag ko kung alin yun doon. So, but those 10 elements, first is locality. When we talk about locality, it's basically an area, the neighborhood, regarded as place occupied by certain people or as the scene of particular events. So, ito yung pinakamadali. locality, locus, yung lugar mismo kung saan nagaganap ang mga saan nakatira, rather, nagdudwell ang mga tao, or at the same time, so nagaganap yung mga particular activities that a community share. That's part of what is locality. So, there was some interesting localities na meron, community localities na meron sa mundo. Meron yung Siwa Oasis. The Oasis, alam natin yung isa sa mga fertile areas sa disyerto, usually sa Middle East, tsaka Northern Africa. Egypt, of mostly Berbers with Siwi language. So, Siwa Oasis is one of the Egypt's most isolated settlements with about 33,000 people, mostly Berbers, who develop a unique culture and distinct language of the Ber family called Siwi. So, yun, isolated groups of people, which are a community as they are basically defined by their locality as to where they live. At the same time, may locality din na tinatawag na Palmerston Cook Island. Basahin ko na ito ha. It's one of the most isolated island communities in the world. The tiny Pacific island of Palmerston is visited by a supply ship twice a year at most. And the long hazardous journey deters all but most intrepid visitors. What's more is that 62 lang. 62 yung inhabitants nila. And all are descendants of one man, si William Masters. So, William Masters lived in the Cook Islands from the 1850s hanggang early 60s. As he was appointed by Palmerston, appointed as caretaker of Palmerston by its then owner, a British merchant, John Brander. He moved there in 1863 accompanied by his wife, a Polynesian woman, and two of her cousins. At yung mga nakatira doon na 62 ay lahat descendants ni William Masters. So, may community na gano'n sa Pacific Islands. May ganyang community na 62 lang sila at mostly majority naman nakatira doon ay descendant ni William Masters. Then, ito pa, Coober Pedy in Australia. It's located in South Australia. The town of Coober Pedy is famous for three things: opal mining, the grassless golf course, and its underground home. So, dahil nga, majority daw ng opal production ay natitrace sa lugar na to, yung mga dating underground mining sites ay dinevelop nila as tirahan. Parang yung masayang yung mga areas na yon, dinevelop nila as tirahan, dwelling place, underground town. At the same time, naging tourist attraction na rin to dun sa southern part ng Australia. Those are some interesting communities based on localities. Yung isa, isolated na oasis. Yung isa, isolated na tiny Pacific island with one descendant. Ito naman, underground town. May mga ganun talaga all around the world. So, moving on, for a community to be considered community, dyan nakapaloob din tayo na community sentiment. That feeling of belongingness. So, dun sa 5 core elements kanina, papasok ito sa sharing. Okay, ito papasok sa sharing. Or joint action. That feeling of belongingness, na feeling mo bahagi ka ng grupo. Belongingness sometimes evolved to an excessive ethnocentrism. In the case of China, may tinatawag na sinocentrism. Which means na any ethnocentric political ideology that regards China to be the central or unique relative to other countries. China number one. Yun yung pinakamadaling explanation. Yung sinocentrism. China umiikot ang mundo. China number one. China number one. And communities, in the case of China or other countries who have that certain ethnocentric view na sila yung the best, um, had that certain level of community sentiment that they belong to that group. Okay? So first, locality followed by community sentiment, the feeling of belongingness. However, in some cases, excessive ethnocentrism results to aggression towards visitors, thus resulting to another isolation. Particularly in the case of North Korea. Gusto nila sa kanilang yung focus to the point na ayaw nila na magkaroon ng ibang tao na pupuna sa mga ginagawa nila. Hence, leading to isolation. Although in the case of North Korea, hindi na sila ganoon ka-aggressive towards visitors, lalo nung si Kim Jong-un ay namumuno sa kanila, because they're trying to get a more hindi ko pinagtatanggol yung kanyang government, but yun yung napansin ko na sa polisiya niya, mas naging open sila sa tourists. Although syempre there's still that idea that na isolated pa rin yung North Korea dahil sobrang outdated ng kanilang technology at even their way of life, their government style remains outdated if we are comparing it from outsiders' perspective. Similarly, one cannot create a community, a government or state cannot create one. A locality can be created. Pwede tayo magsama-sama sa isang lugar at tawagin natin na MCL locality. But a community, not so much. Because community only creates itself. May tinatawag kasi na naturality. Naturality. Pag sinabi natin naturality, it's neither a product of human will rather, nor created by an act of the government. Walang batas na magsasabi na gagawin kong community ang lugar na ito. Walang batas na pwede mag-declare. Pwede mong i-declare na city, na town, na barangay, palitan mong pangalan yan. But the idea of community, hindi siya mailalagay basta-basta as something na legal. Mamaya pag-usapan pa natin yun. Because it should be naturally occurring. It grows spontaneously. Individuals became a member rather by birth. Ibig sabihin, it grows out of nowhere. Without even realizing it, you're considering your neighborhood as a community where you belong. Why? Because you have that certain sense of belongingness. You have that certain sense of being part of the group. You have that certain sense na may permanence, which is another element. Pag-usapan natin mamaya. But the thing with naturality is that community only creates itself. Darating sa punto, yung mga grupo ng tao na nasa isang lugar na nagsama-sama, na may social ties, ay magkakaroon ng understanding na we are a community here. Ganun naman yung mga Filipino community sa ibang bansa. Hindi naman basta-basta na lang tinawag nila yung sarili nila na Filipino community. It took some time before such communities created. Because magkakasama yung mga Pilipino, pare-parehas ng karanasan, habang nasa Amerika, habang nasa ibang bansa. And because they share that same sentiments, they belong, and at the same time they have that same upbringing, same experiences. Spontaneously, they consider themselves as a community, as a group that are thriving for that similar purpose. So the community that is Filipino did not become to be when Burgos Rizal or certain Creoles are mixed race, Spanish or Europeans and others, no, mixed races. or Bonifacio started to use the term. Back then, the term Filipino was alien to every other Filipinos that we know today. Only few Visayans and Mindanaoans would even acknowledge it. Yung Filipino, the term, even the Filipino term as a community was not even used. Siguro kung hindi pa na-establish yung um, kasanila ng Pilipinas, hindi pa natin tatawagin mga sarili natin ng mga Pilipino. Tayo mga Tagalog, mga Bisayan, mga Mindanaoans, mga Ilocano. Yeah, ganun kawatak-watak yung mindset before. It wasn't, I think, until the late 50s, no? Nung lumaya na talaga tayo. At in-establish yung pambansang wika at in-establish yung Pilipinas bilang isang bansa. Doon lang natin dahan-dahang tinanggap yung pagiging Pilipino natin. It's also important to distinguish community from a crowd or association. So, if we are to ask ano yung pagkakaiba ng crowd or association from community, isa lang yung sagot. Permanence. Crowds will come and go. Associations will come and go. Pag wala ng pinagkapare-parehas nila, crowds, association, communities, merong joint action. Merong, may gusto silang gawin as a group. However, for crowds, if na-achieve na nila yung goal nila, magdi-disperse na yon, pwedeng matapos na. Pwedeng mawala na yung grupo. For associations, if nagkaroon ng internal conflicts, nawala yung mga officers, na they lost sight of the goal or na-achieve na rin nila yung goal nila, pwedeng mawala na yung association. However, for community, regardless of what happens, for better or for worse, the community will remain because permanence is another element that's part of a community. While it's problematic to think that a community is absolutely permanent, it's better to think of it as not just passing or not temporary. So take note of that. Hindi naman necessarily absolutely permanent. Wala naman talagang permanente sa mundong ito. Yeah. But the thing with community is that comparing community with crowds or association, hindi yung pumunta ka lang doon para maging bahagi for a meantime. For communities, you are part of a community because you think that you and those people who are part of that community share that same sentiment, that you think or you want to think that you belong to that community kahit anong gawin nila sa'yo. Okay, kahit siguro para magkaroon ng problema. But what's important is that it's not just passing, it's not temporary. There's a certain feeling of permanence. So, yun na lang mas tama. Feeling of permanence when it comes to a community. So, some facts. Damascus, Syria is the oldest city in the world. 11,000 years old. Sadly, hindi ko sure kung ganito pa rin yung itsura nito. Alam ko, some parts of Syria were devastated by internal conflicts 5 years ago, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. Oldest province in Aklan was established in the 12th century, formerly known as Minuro et Akean. Okay? So, it's way back in the 12th century. Hindi pa ganyan yung itsura niya. Okay, sorry. Iba yan ha. Wala akong mahanap ng mas lumang larawan. Kung yung kahamali tayo, nasa 15th century na itong larawang to. But as early as that, 12th century. Yung oldest province, Aklan. Oldest town in the Philippines is Unisan, Quezon. Established in 1521, formerly known as Kalilayan. So, Unisan was the oldest town in the Philippines. 1521. So, hindi pa ako nakapunta dito. I think nasa may northern Quezon yata to. Sorry, hindi ko sure. Hindi ako, masyado mahaba, malawak kasi ang Quezon, kaya hindi ako familiar talaga. But, hopefully, at some point, mabisita ko to. Aside from being in the same locality, a community will also develop commonality. Ito yung sharing, no? Sharing. Members share similarities. So, kung ano may similarities na yun, it doesn't need to be readily seen, tangible. It can be intangible. Characteristics, behavior. Pero ang pinakamadali yung mga observable eh. Bawa, ano? Question dito, what is common in your community? Excuse. What are distinctions between Kabuyeños, Calambeños, and Rosenians? Yung may tawag sa Santa Rosa. Yan. So, Kalamba, ito, si Dr. Jose Rizal. Sa Binyan, Puto, Puto Binyan. So, ito yung pinaka-familiar sa akin. Paki-correct na ako mali. Santa Rosa's Nuvali. Nuvali. San Pedro, Manok. Saka yung tulay na hindi na natapos-tapos. Tapos na ba? Wala, hindi na ako updated eh. Alam niyo ba yung mga taga San Pedro? And sa Kabuyaw, itong simbahan. Yung may multo. May multo dito, di ba? Yung mga taga Kabuyaw. Hindi ko pa napupuntahan yun, sa totoo lang. Traffic kasi sa bahagi ng pabayan eh. Kaya hindi ako napapadpad. But yeah, ito yung mga key features that possibly similarities ng bawat taga Kalamba, Santa Rosa, Binyan, San Pedro, Kabuyaw. Pag nakita mo ito, ay alam mo taga Kalamba yan. Alam niya about kay Rizal ito. Oh, Binyan ka, so Puto, sarap yan. San Pedro, Manok, di ba? Yung tulay nyo, hindi na natapos. Santa Rosa, nakapunta ka Nuvali, yung mga ganong concerns or questions to. Also, a community will also develop its own politics and commerce. Thus, a community must also have organization. Ibig sabihin, how it is being organized or led or managed. So, for communities that are cities, towns, or even barangays, obviously meron ng may mga local governments to lead them. For siguro for mga subdivisions, especially mga high-end subdivisions, may mga homeowners, I think, or even yung mga mid-tier, may mga homeowners association which basically manages or manages the community. What kind of politics is involved in your own community? Is there a dynasty of sort? Mga key questions to ponder when it comes to organization. What kind of person is acting as the leader in your community? What kind of commerce is existent? Communities near a playas will definitely have different commerce than communities near centers, near yung agora, marketplace, economic centers. So, similarly, community is incomplete without a name. Pang 7 pa siya, Yes, kasi before a community will have a name, again, it's naturally occurring. Hindi mo muna papangalanan yung isang grupo hanggang hindi ka umabot sa punto na tingin mo established na ito yung ganong idea. Community, in terms of community, a community without a name, even without official name, members of community will think of something to name theirs, usually rooting from the name of their place, which are sometimes also invented. So, example is Filipino community, lalo kung nasa ibang bansa, Waray community, which is commonly united by their common language. Unisan communities based on their location, Kalamba community, or kung sa subdivision kayo nakatira, South Point ba? South Pilipinas, hindi ko na matandaan. Mamaya, lang, siguro sa Kalamba, Villa de Calamba community. Some would even name their street and think of it as a distinct community. Pasillos usually become a community of its own. Pasillos, mga eskinita. Certain streets in highly urbanized communities become community of its own. Blocks in certain villages also do. So, specific areas or streets can be considered a community of its own. Now, an important question as we move along: can the government or anyone put up a legal case against a community? The answer: a legal case can be put up against a person or a legal group, a recognized group. However, not against an abstract concept of community. Again, abstract yung concept, no? It's a construct, yung komunidad. For example, UAE cannot ban Filipino community from entering their country, but they can ban Filipino citizens because citizenship is legal in nature. Filipino community, on the other hand, it's an abstract concept. It's a construct, something that's not legally defined. As such, community therefore has no legal status. Since it is not created by law, it is bounded by it. Okay? Walang legal na status, no? Walang legal na batas na magbubuo na pwede kang na mag-organize ng isang community. Pero pasok yung mga batas sa isang komunidad. Lalo kung kayo, halimbawa sa Pilipinas, or kung ano mga batas meron sa locality niyo, pasok yung mga batas na yun sa pagpapatakbo ng komunidad. However, hindi defined by law ang isang community. As such, hindi pwedeng kasuhan isang community. Hindi pwedeng mag-take ng legal actions towards a community. You can only do that to a legally defined elements of the state. In the case, Filipinos or people or a group, a legally defined group, but not community per se. Another element is the size. Dami ng tao. The least populated capital city in the world is Adamstown, Pitcairn Islands, with population of 45 as of 2010. And 2018 estimated 50. The largest cities in the world are Shanghai, Beijing, and Delhi with a population of 24, 21, 17 million respectively. 2018 to. And they think it has grown more in the past 2 years. Last but certainly not the least, a community has its own structure, distinguishable nature and structure. No two communities will ever be the same. Community locations are pretty much varied. Second, the overall culture of one community will always be different from another one. It is that very sense that a specific community became a community that is its own. So, no communities will ever be the same. Kahit i-duplicate mo yan, magkakaroon ng certain variations. As such, for a community, it will always have that distinguishable nature and structure. Something that will define them or differentiate them over other communities. Thus, when we talk about the elements of community, it has locality or a certain territory, community sentiment or feeling of belongingness, naturality, not a product of human will or the government, Permanence, it's not temporary. It's not passing. Commonality, members sharing similarities. Organization, that there is social organization. Similarly, community is a miniature society. This particular name, no legal status, size, and distinguishable nature and structure. Those 10 are the specific elements of what a community is, as to how we want to know a community or what a community is.